Hello and welcome back to the Hazzabhajan YouTube channel. It is Harry here, and today it is time for the second installment in the Dictators in Football series, where I have a look at the various roles played by dictators in the world of football in their various countries. If you missed the first episode, it was quite a while ago and it was on Benito Mussolini. A link to it is in the description down below. In this video, I'm going to be taking a look at football under the Nazi regime, be it its actual football or its wider political connotations, as well as the national team and how their fortunes fared. Unlike Mussolini, Adolf Hitler didn't have much of an interest in football himself, but what he and his party did realise was its propaganda potential and how it could be mobilised to great effect to boost the morale of the German people. Unfortunately, in line with his anti-Semitic policies, which I must stress straight away that I do not condone in any way, shape or form and find as deplorable and inhumane as any other policy of that ilk, his impact on football in Germany had much further reaching implications than it being used as a mere propaganda weapon. Hitler joined the German Workers' Party in 1919, which was later changed to the Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeitspartei, or the Nazi Party for short. Despite friction with his party members owing to his ambitions being much higher than theirs, and an arrest during a march on Munich in November 1923, Hitler grew in popularity across Germany, with his anti-Marxist and anti-Semitic policies formally outlined in Mein Kampf, his book which he partly wrote whilst incarcerated. Despite economic growth after the terrible inflation that had hit Germany in the post-World War I years, the Wall Street crash in 1929 hit Germany massively, and 6 million people would be unemployed by 1932. With Hitler's propaganda machine in full force, exposing the perceived weaknesses of the incumbent government during the Depression, their electoral vote percentage rose from 2.6% in the 1928 election to 18% in 1930 and 36% by November 1932. By January 1933, Hitler demanded that he become Chancellor, which Paul von Hindenburg relented to, and on the 23rd of March 1933, a motion was passed declaring that Hitler had absolute control over Germany, thus establishing his role as the Führer. Football proved immensely popular amongst the working class citizens during his dictatorship, with Goebbels writing, "Winning a match is more important to the people than the potential capture of a town in the East." Unfortunately, football in Germany would be blighted by many despicable anecdotes over the coming years. But before we get into that, let's focus on how football was structured during the Nazi regime. The league was a collection of Gauligen, or regional leagues, with the top teams from each regional league qualifying for a national tournament, which was mostly a knockout format. The word Gau means tribe, and it was a word that the Nazis brought back into popularity after it had not been used for some time. 17 Gauligen existed in 1933, but by the end of World War II, a staggering 30 were in play, many of whom having split from other Gauligen, and 7 of them came by virtue of Germany's annexation of certain countries such as Czechoslovakia and Austria. This led to around 600 sides competing in Germany's top flight, which was cut to 170 upon World War II's less than triumphant conclusion for the Germans. However, the authorities realised pretty quickly that this overbloating of the league wasn't particularly conducive to the sport's development within the country, and they attempted to hold a meeting to pass a motion to create a Reichsliga in the country, something akin to England's First Division or Italy's Serie A, merely 2 months after Hitler's declaration as absolute leader. The meeting and the plans, however, were both scrapped, as it would mean that the country would have to go professional, something uncompliant to Nazi ideologies, although they were brought up again after their disastrous 1938 World Cup campaign. A meeting to make a final decision on this front was scheduled for August 1939, but then the war happened and the plans were shelved once again. A nationwide league wouldn't come into existence for another 24 years. There was also a cup competition named in honour of the Reichssportführer, Hans von Scharmerton-Osten, a gregarious man who apparently knew nothing about sport, despite being in charge of the country's sporting operations. Sounds vaguely familiar. Some reports at the time claimed that Hitler's favourite club was Schalke, although he never expressed a clear allegiance to any team, and when the Times propagated this claim in their 1998 article of the 50 worst football fans, they were rebuked by Schalke themselves, who actually sent a letter of complaint to the newspaper. What is undeniable though is that the Gelsenkirchen outfit emerged as the prominent club during the Nazi era, and their league successes would be inextricably tied to the regime. It's a shame really, as their style of play, nicknamed the spinning top, was a joy to behold, as they abandoned robustness and instead focused on keeping the ball on the ground and, when off the ball, looking for space to run into for a teammate to pass them the ball. Their style of play is what should be recognised more for posterity, but alas, the facts tell us that only 1 out of their 7 league triumphs to date has come outside of the Nazi regime, so that is the greater talking point. Interestingly, the German national team manager, Otto Nerz, disliked the way Schalke played, despite their unbridled success, refusing to pick many of them for the national team, including their star man Enes Kozora, and Fritz Zeppan, another one of their star players, was frequently played out of position. In spite of their bizarre absence from the national team, they won 11 straight Gauliga between 1934 and 1944, and between 1934 and 1942, they would win the national championships 6 times, losing in the final twice more. This is the point in the video where politics have to enter the conversation. On the 2nd of June 1933, Bernhard Rust, who was the Minister for Education, issued a decree that Jews were to be removed from all sporting organisations. A tenth of the pre-war Jewish population would be involved to some capacity in sports teams, but one by one their memberships or contracts would be nulled and voided. Whilst many clubs claimed that they had no choice but to remove any Jews associated with their club, many were actually complicit in this despicable act prior to the decree being passed. In April 1933, the prominent Kicker magazine issued a rally cry to remove the quote-unquote unacceptable Marxists and Jews. The sad thing was, the Kicker magazine was actually established by a Jew, Walter Benjamin. Nuremberg, who were one of the best teams at the time, and Eintracht Frankfurt issued these orders before the official decree came, although Bayern Munich made no secret of their allegiance to their forcibly disposed Jewish president, Kurt Landauer, and he would return to the club in the exact same role once the war was over. This led to Bayern being treated as suspicious by the Nazis, with their rivals, 1860 Munich, being given much greater preferential treatment by the party, and Bayern's triumph in 1932 would remain their only league title until the late 1960s. Chapin would also become heavily active in the Nazi regime, and when a road was posited to be named after him in 2001, the truth came to light and the authorities withdrew the name change immediately, further prompting Schalke to investigate their potential relationship with the Nazi regime, the first German club to do so. The Nazi Party's influence on the game went into overdrive from 1935, buoyed on by the success of the Mannschafts' first foray into the World Cup, when they reached the semi-finals in 1934. The first instance of this came with the England vs Germany game in 1935, the first game between the two nations since the Nazis came to power, and 10,000 German supporters were due to go to the game. The Home Office issued a warning to the Germans, barring them from holding any propaganda matches in the city, to which Hitler himself responded by telling the German ambassador in Britain that the FA could cancel the game if they were so disgusted by the actions of the German people. Further complications come to light when you remember that White Hart Lane plays host to Spurs, who traditionally have had a very strong Jewish following, and over 50 letters were sent begging for the game to be abandoned. The FA, as they so often did in those days, turned a blind eye to them, and England won 3-0, although the Germans put in a decent performance, giving them high hopes for what was to come. Unfortunately, they would all come crashing down in the most humiliating fashion. Hitler only actually attended one football match in his entire life, which came in 1936, during what was meant to be a showpiece event for the Nazi regime, the Berlin Olympics. At the time, the Olympics was the most prestigious sporting competition on the planet, as whilst there were a few international sports events by this stage, including in shooting, fencing, tennis and hockey, they were mostly either fledgling or not overly popularised in the media. Football's own World Cup, for one, had only seen 2 editions to date, and the Olympic football tournament, despite being strictly for amateurs, was certainly seen as on par with, if not of marginally greater importance than, the World Cup at this point. The Berlin Games have been controversial to say the least, especially after Hitler staunchly refused to shake hands with American sprinter Jesse Owens on the basis that he was black, and the Germans, especially those in the Iron Race, hadn't picked up as many medals as the Führer would have wanted. On day 7 of the games, Hitler was eyeing up the rowing and polo competitions, but an official of a regional FA told him to attend the Germany vs Norway football match instead, telling him that, quote unquote, the team will win gold. Goebbels, Rust, Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess and Wilhelm Frick all high-ranking Nazi Party officials join him at Berlin's Poststadion alongside 55,000 others expecting a German win. After all, they've beaten Luxembourg 9-0 in the first round, so a bloodbath was anticipated. They would be stunned. Norway took the lead after just 7 minutes through Magnar Isaksson, and Goebbels picked up on how frantic Hitler was whilst watching the game. After the breakthrough, it was wave after wave of German attacks, desperately trying to break down the stubborn Norway defence, so much so that Otto Nerz, still the coach by this point, sent the defence up front in order to try and salvage the game. In one of the biggest smash and grabs in football history, Norway raced up the other end, perhaps for the first time since their opening strike, and Isaksson scored his second goal of the game 7 minutes from time. Hitler left the ground in disgust, never to return again to a football game. 2 years on, global tensions were high, and they only increased upon Hitler's invasion into, and subsequent annexation of, Austria, his homeland. In a footballing sense, this meant that teams from Austria were allowed to compete in the German leagues, with Admira Vienna reaching the final in 1939, and Rapid Vienna even having the temerity to win the competition in 1941. That triumph was tinged with controversy though, as their opponent Schalke claimed that Rapid were being favoured because those in power wanted an Austrian side to win, although such claims have been proven false. On the international stage, FIFA had a headache-inducing issue to contend with too, as a result of this development in global politics. Austria, alongside Germany, had qualified for the 1938 World Cup in France, but after the Anschluss, Austria informed FIFA of them ceasing to exist autonomously, and so Germany would have to share a pitch with members of the Austrian Wunder team at the finals. Before that though, a match celebrating unity and brotherhood between the two nations was scheduled to take place on the 3rd of April 1938, but Austria would cause an upset by beating the Germans 2-0 after goals from Karl Sester and Matthias Sindelar, who had the courage to celebrate wildly in front of on-watching Nazi officials. As star of the Wunder team, Sindelar refused to turn out for the newly combined side at the World Cup, openly expressing his distaste at the regime. Merely 9 months after this game, Sindelar died in mysterious circumstances alongside his girlfriend, through carbon monoxide fumes emanating from her flat's chimneys, with rumours circulating that the Nazis were the ones who actually organised it, although they are unproven and probably untrue. England would face Germany again in 1938 and, in line with Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's appeasement policies towards the Germans, gave the Nazi salute pre-match. The players protested, with Stanley Matthews claiming that the team's captain, Eddie Hapgood, told those who instructed the team to give the salute to stick it, quote unquote, where the sun don't shine. They also believed that Hitler would be at the game, although whoever gave the all clear is actually unknown, most likely to be the British ambassador in Berlin, Neville Henderson, who was also pro-appeasement, or the FA secretary and future FIFA president, Stanley Roos. Hitler wasn't present in any case, and England went on to win 6-3. So preparations for Die Mannschaft weren't great leading up to the 1938 World Cup, and it was made even worse when the team was instructed to have a ratio of as close to half and half from each of the two nations as physically possible, playing at all times. This was actually instigated by Hitler himself in order to hopefully maintain cordial relations between the two sides, although all it did was create understandable friction on both sides of the camp, with both sides hating each other in equal measure. Their lack of chemistry would show on the pitch, as they were dumped out in the first round of the tournament by their neighbours Switzerland after a replay. The Austrians were, naturally, the scapegoats, with their lack of mental fortitude cited as the reason for Germany's defeat. Germany wouldn't be knocked out again in the first round of a World Cup until 2018. War was ever looming, with tensions rising and Germany continuing to annex countries at a rapid rate. Chamberlain's policies could only work for so long, and following Germany's invasion into Poland, the British declared war on Germany in September 1939. However, football would continue throughout the vast majority of the war almost like normal, unlike in the vast majority of European countries who would take part in the war to some capacity, as the Gauligen was still held, and with many of them now in play. This was depicted as a huge propaganda triumph for the Germans, as football could continue unimpeded, unlike in weaker Western countries like Britain or France, where football ground to a halt. What's more, the national team managed to fit in a staggering 35 matches between the start of the war and the end of 1942. Games were also scheduled for 1943, but after their battle on the Eastern Front started to go awry, they were cancelled. Germany wouldn't play another international match until 1950. However, the country's image would be further tainted after an infamous game between Flakov and Start in Ukraine. The Nazis would occupy Ukraine in 1941, and many clubs were disbanded, although workers in a bakery who used to play for Dynamo Kiev and Lokomotiv Kiev, amongst a few other clubs, came together to form FC Start. Start would thrash all who stood in their way, so the Germans sent over their best team under the alias of Flakov, which mostly consisted of players from the Luftwaffe who were anti-aircraft gunners and engineers. They were supposedly invincible, but Start would end up beating them 5-1 on the 6th of August 1942, and in the hastily arranged rematch 3 days later, Flakov went down again, this time by a score of 5-3. Anti-Nazi chants were heard throughout the game, and it became a symbol for many of communism versus fascism. In light of this embarrassment, games were banned between German and Soviet sides in order to avoid more humiliations like the ones Flakov were the victims of. But on the 18th of August, merely 9 days after the second game had taken place, all of the Start players who worked in the bread factory were arrested. The Lokomotiv affiliated players were released, but the others were kept under suspicion of being NKVD officers, with one being tortured to such an extent that he suffered a heart attack, from which he eventually died. 5 more players in the squad would lose their lives, and 3 more would be sent to concentration camps. The game has become known as the Death Match. Eventually, it became pretty clear that the Allies would defeat the Nazis, and sports in the country just about soldiered on until April 1945, as the Allies surrounded Germany on all sides, with the 1944-45 football season never having an opportunity to reach its conclusion. A week on from the last organised football match in the Nazi era, Hitler poisoned his wife Eva Braun before shooting himself, and Goebbels, the one who promoted sports so intensely through his propaganda machine, poisoned his children before shooting himself and his wife, unable to bear the burden of not overseeing the start of a 1,000-year Reich. Germany's surrender came on the 8th of May 1945, and with that came the official end of Nazi rule over Germany. Football would be split into 7 newly named Oberliga in the US occupied zones and Berlin, with 4 alone being held in the capital, and a national German competition would not return until 1948, after the 3 Allied zones combined to make West Germany. Undoubtedly, football had been a pivotal propaganda tool, even if Hitler himself didn't take to the game at all, although Germany wasn't able to match the global sporting success that the Italians would experience in the same period, meaning that, ultimately, their vision of sporting supremacy would never materialise in the same way that it did for Mussolini. Having said that, West Germany would win 2 World Cups before Italy could get their hands on their next one, both freed by this point from the shackles of a brutal dictatorship, going on to establish themselves as powerhouses of the game, something that they would never achieve under Hitler's dictatorship. That just about concludes today's video. Thank you very much for watching. I really hope that you found it informative or interesting in some way, and if you did, hit the like button and hit that subscribe button as well, and comment with what you think of this whole situation and maybe who I should cover next in this series. But thank you very much for watching in any case, and until next time, I'll see you then.